Should I just launch into it, sir?
Yes.
Well, hello and welcome. My name is Honest Al Stare. I am a sideline interpreter and umpire for vintage baseball. Many of you may have seen me out on a match. You might not recognize me because I haven't grown in my sideburns yet, but fear not, they're here. The sideburns will eventually be making their way onto my face. So I started as an umpire with the VBB in June of 2005. I never played. I got into vintage as an umpire, and that is all I ever have done through vintage baseball. I was recruited, or I probably never would have found vintage. I was attracted to it because I love baseball and I love performing. The first team manager who got me involved with vintage baseball found me through our local theater guild. That's a tip if you're trying to find a team umpire. You don't necessarily want to look to your players. First off, most players would rather be playing. Also, a player who knows the game front to back might be lousy when it comes to explaining it to a stranger, let alone a group of strangers. If you've got a community theater near you or a Toastmasters chapter in your area, try to find somebody who's comfortable getting up and talking in front of a crowd. If they also happen to like baseball, you might wind up with an umpire for years and years. That's what happened with me. That first team that I called for, they only lasted a couple of years. They all quit, but I continued because I was having way too much fun doing this. This summer is my 17th season, although I did take 2020 off for the pandemic. Now, since 2005, I've called more than 400 vintage matches. Umpiring vintage has given me some amazing opportunities. I got to call a weekend of matches at the Field of Dreams in Dyersville. 2 years ago, I was a guest of the Edison Ford Estate in Fort Myers, Florida, where I got to call matches on a spring training field that had once been home to Ty Cobb. I've met many of you at the Ohio Cup in Columbus. I was a guest umpire there for 6 years in a row. If you're considering getting involved with VBBA as an umpire, I highly recommend it. The folks you'll meet are some of the best people in the world, and you get to enjoy some fun baseball with a ringside seat. Now, it's important to note, when I got into vintage, I knew nothing about vintage baseball or historic baseball. I was by no means a scholar of the game. I followed the Cardinals every year, but I had no knowledge about the pre-professional era, the Knickerbockers, or the gentleman's game. I'd seen Ken Burns' baseball, but it had been several years, and all that stuff was in part one, and who remembers part one? So it took me a while, but I learned that the most important thing you can do as a vintage umpire is to educate yourself about the game and the era. And I know that sounds pretty basic, but you'd be surprised. When I started doing this, there were very few resources available to vintage clubs and especially vintage umpires. Plus, much of what was out there we now know to be wrong. I spent my first 4 or 5 seasons referring to myself as an arbiter. I make a face now saying that word, but I didn't then. It's what I'd been told I should call my position, and I accepted that as correct information. That is an important point to keep in mind. Newbies trust the veterans. It's in our nature. You look to those with experience to learn the ropes. If the veterans have bad information, they're going to pass it on to you as the newbie. That's what was happening to me, but I didn't know it. I was eagerly soaking in all of this wildly wrong information about the gentleman's game. And of course, I was spreading what I was learning far and wide. In about 2010, I remember sitting with a beer in the bar at the Ohio Cup, talking to a guy who was telling me some very detailed bit of information about how they used to do it. After he'd gone on at length, I said, "So how do you know that?" And it wasn't a challenge. I was just wanting to get the same book or article he'd read so I could get the same information. It made him stop. He looked a little confused, and finally he said, "I don't know. Somebody told me." And I started asking that question more and more often. How do you know that? How do you know what they wore, what they said, how they stood when they were out on the field? Nobody ever pointed to a history book as justification for their claim. They all had heard it from somebody. I discovered that vintage baseball was fueled by its own grapevine of fairly inaccurate information. Some things were right, but a whole lot of things were really, really sketchy. In 2011, I did something huge. It changed my VBB life. I cracked open a book about the history of baseball. I know that sounds somewhat elementary, and I'm embarrassed to say it took me 5 years to do it, but I know I'm not alone. There are many very devoted vintage enthusiasts running around out there right now with bad information who've never opened a book. I run into them almost every weekend all season long. They are so excited about this wonderful hobby they're involved in, and they want to tell everybody, but they're passing along bad info that they got word of mouth. They don't want to be passing along inaccurate info. They don't know that they're doing it. It's happening because what they're getting by word of mouth may have started out as accurate at some point, but it's being told and retold with errors and misinterpretations being added into the retelling. I highly recommend to anyone who wants to get into being a vintage umpire or sideline interpreter, go directly to printed source material. Don't listen to what you're being told and accept it as fact. Find authors and historians who write about this stuff. Read a book or two about the gentleman's era of baseball. You need to go to trusted, historically accurate source material. It's the only way to eliminate the errors that can come about by retelling a story. There are a number of fantastic publications, and I'm sure with this group I don't need to tell you about the fantastic Rules of the Game by Eric Micklick, which is free to download from the VBBA.org website. It is a great place to start if you are recruiting an umpire for your club. Hand them this valuable piece of information. Send them the PDF. If you are a VBB umpire or you've gotten one recruited for your team, here is a mantra that I say to myself every time I walk onto a field. I know a few things that are right rather than a whole lot of things that are wrong. There is a learning curve to becoming a vintage umpire. You're not going to know everything overnight, and it is hard to accept the limitations of what you know, but keep studying. Add to your knowledge base slowly, learn a few bedrock things, then branch out from there. By reading and rereading your most trusted source material, you start to memorize the stories and the dates and the events. Write out some simple timelines and commit them to memory. Learn the landmark dates. Have those available top of mind, like the Knickerbocker rule set, the first NABBP convention. Learn the major changes that happened between rule sets, especially the ones that you call. Again, this is where Eric's book, The Rules of the Game, is indispensable source material, and it's a free download from VBBA.org. Do not feel like you have to answer every question. This is one of the toughest things to do for a sideline interpreter. If you don't know something, don't be afraid to tell a spectator, I don't know that one. Don't blow smoke. If they ask one that's not in your wheelhouse, just admit it. On the other side of things, don't blizzard your people with every bit of info that's in your brain, even if you've got all the details down. Too much of the right info can be just as bad information. As a sideline interpreter, you got to keep your audience in mind. Think about where you're running into these audiences. Usually you're playing on a weekend. Sometimes you're playing in conjunction with a street festival or a historic celebration, and your audience is made up of people who happen to wander by. They pause for a minute to enjoy the folks in the interesting costumes playing a game that looks a little like baseball. They might wonder why it hit the ground, but the batter seemed to have been called out. You have to understand that might be the full extent of their interest. The folks attending those weekend celebrations did not sign up for a history class. They don't want to be lectured to or overloaded with information. They aren't looking to be bombarded with a ton of minutia. As hard as this may be to hear, guys, they don't care about this stuff nearly as much as we do, and you have to temper your approach based on that. They aren't going to remember a lot of what you say. So make what you say count and make it memorable. Make sure those things they do remember are correct. Your goal should be to have a spectator walk away from your match with one or two big and correct facts they will remember and will be able to share later. That is way better than blasting them with 50 little details that they can't recall 10 minutes after they walked away. Memorize a few dates, know a few firsts, but one of the best ways to connect with an audience is through anecdotal, true stories that you can tell quickly and well. Certain historians tell a good story. I like John Thorne for great anecdotes. That first book that I mentioned, Cracking Open, was actually Thorne's Baseball in the Garden of Eden, which is the secret history of the early game. A lot of great stuff in there. I still get it out each year to reread and review my highlighted passages. I suggest when you find a story you like that can be told in a couple of minutes and it's something that speaks to you, you find it interesting, it's something you want to share, copy it from the source material. Collect those stories in a notebook or put them in a computer document. I stick mine in a notepad document. Learn them and learn how to tell them. Try to memorize details about them. Review them often during the season. I'm afraid I've forgotten mine because I've been off for over a year now. My pandemic brain is mush. So I've forgotten a lot of the details of my favorite anecdotes, and I need to refresh here as we move into the season. So how do you get out there and dispense these pearls of wisdom to a waiting audience? You need to make yourself visible and available. If you aren't a player, don't umpire in street clothes. Create a costume for yourself. Even though you may not be in a uniform, your style of dress should stand out so the audience knows that you are a part of the presentation. I like to perform in the style of an 1860s Civil War era Illinois businessman. I'd most likely be a respected member of a well-established frontier community, and it's possible I might also be a financial contributor to a baseball club. My playing days are behind me, but I love to help out as an umpire when the boys get together to face off against another club. This is my backstory for my character. It's who I am, and it's why I would be out with a baseball team on a Sunday afternoon. I got some pointers on my costume by calling the Lincoln Library and Museum just to ask them a few questions. Museums love to talk about this kind of stuff. I wear a short top hat because we're not as fancy here in the frontier. If you go further east, you'll notice umpires tend to have taller top hats and wear more formal dress because here in Illinois we don't put on airs. By creating a costume, you're also creating a character. I love playing the character of Honest Al. I've performed as Honest Al long enough. I've created a fairly detailed backstory. And a lot of my backstory is purely for laughs. If you can get people laughing, you can get them to listen to you. I'm always running a con. Like, I've got my brother who recently took over an abandoned silver mine in Minnesota. He's sure to hit a rich vein any day now, and I could get you in on the ground floor. Shares are only $5 each. They're going to be worth $25 by the end of the month, I guarantee it. It's Branson-level hokey, but it's a fun way to interact with the audience, and it makes you memorable and accessible. I always have a few bits loaded up and ready to go just to have some fun with the spectators. I love to work a crowd before a match in character. I do improv with the livelier members of the group. I'm trying to sell everybody shares in the silver mine, whatever it might be. Getting out in the crowd and letting them interact with you makes you more approachable later. If they have a question during the match, they're going to feel way more comfortable talking to the person who was joking around with them beforehand. If you're aloof or standoffish as an umpire, the audience is less likely to ask you questions. So that's making yourself visible, but don't forget about the available part. Tell your audience and tell them frequently. If you have questions about what you're watching, let me know. If it's the usual team families in the crowd, you're not going to get a lot of questions. They already know what they're looking at. If you're getting passers-by, they're going to stop and ask as long as you put that invitation out there, and they're going to ask about the cosmetic things first. Vintage doesn't look exactly right to somebody who's used to watching modern baseball, and they're going to want to know why. So have a quick answer ready for the one bound rule and why the pitcher throws it like that. They're going to want to know why you don't call strikes and balls if that is your rule set. If there's enough equipment, have a bat and a ball handy just for you to use for show and tell. In 15 years, I'd say the number one question I'd ever been asked is about the ball. Being able to toss them one for inspection answers a lot of questions. Know sizes and weights. One more time, a shout out for Eric Miklich's Rules of the Game. I like to compare what we're using for vintage to a modern ball. It gives people a frame of reference. Point out the difference in the stitch pattern, how the vintage ball usually feels a little squishier than a machine-wound ball. The fact that one ball would not only be used for an entire match, sometimes one ball might last the better part of a season. The ball was a valuable handmade commodity in the gentleman's era, and people love hearing about it. Learn some information about the bats being used. For some reason, equipment fascinates people. A fun fact I like to point out, the rules in our era only restrict the diameter, not the length of the bat. So you can find stories about 6'8" guys who were wielding 48 and 50-inch bats. That's a fun, visual, anecdotal story that I've actually had a spectator remember from one season to the next. So I accomplished that goal of getting them to walk away with one fact. Also, don't miss out on getting your team on board with your efforts as an interpreter. As you get better and better at the sideline interpreting thing, you're going to realize you can't be everywhere on the sidelines and calling the match all at once. You need to enlist the help of your club. It might sound hokey, but I have come to believe over the years that every person who puts on a vintage uniform and competes in a vintage match is an ambassador of the game. It's your responsibility, even as a player, to at least be able to answer some of the basic questions about the game and answer them correctly. Now, I'm registered as an umpire with the VBB, and I'll work for any team who needs me, but I do consider the Springfield, Illinois Long Nine to be my home club. The Long Nine have been great about putting up with my umpire learning curve over the last decade. As I discover new information, I share it with them, and we all try to incorporate it into our matches. Now, sure, they will slip up occasionally still to this day with an arbiter or a crank, and they're trying to get the information right, and I appreciate it, but we still stumble. Now, one of the neat things that has developed with the Long Nine is a sense of hierarchy when it comes to answering spectator questions. I compare it to like a customer service department. For most things, anyone can handle the question. The guys know bat and ball questions. They know glove questions. They know basic play and rules questions. They can handle a lot of audience interaction on their own because I've made sure to arm them with the right information. Anytime I learn something important that might be different from something we've been doing, I make sure to share it with the club. They understand I've been studying the history and the era. I've kind of set myself up as the expert for the club. So now if they get a question that's beyond their scope, they'll hand it off to me. I'll hear from across the diamond, "Hey, Al," some player waving me over to a spectator with some offbeat question. Sometimes I can answer it, but a lot of the time I have to tell them I don't know. That's what you get when you're working with amateur historians/baseball players. So share and repeat correct and accurate information with their team so they will learn it. Also, and this can be tough, try to rein in overly talkative players. Usually some of the most talkative and excited players on a club will be the newest. Their head is filled with a few things they were told and a few things they've seen, and they're super excited about talking about this new hobby they've gotten, so they fill in the rest. And rarely is any of it right. A lot of times you can hear an overly talkative player as they move away from what they're comfortable with and actually know and veer into that smoke-blowing territory. Stop them before they start blowing smoke and try to get them back on the right track when it comes to accurate information. So use your club as an extension of your instruction. It can be very valuable. Think of them as a bunch of teaching assistants. Keeping them on the right page and armed with the most correct information can be a challenge, but it will definitely pay off throughout the season. So what we're doing as vintage umpires and sideline interpreters is a cross between a lecture and a show. You're trying hard to be a good teacher. You want to make sure your students are getting the right information. But unlike most teachers, our students can get up and walk out of the class anytime they want. That's where the show comes in. In order to get the information to them, you have to keep them there. Be fun, be entertaining, in my case, be loud, because that's how you're going to get your students to listen to you. And I think that is my time on the art of umpiring. If anybody has any questions, let me know.
Hey, Al, this is Corky.
Yeah.
First of all, a compliment to you. I've really enjoyed watching you grow as an umpire over the last 12 years since I met you. It's been a remarkable story. Kind of a shout out to your WKRP cast. I kind of feel like we were all taught that turkeys could fly at some point, and they can't. But to Rudy's point earlier with the cell phone, trying to do a podcast, we're going to turn a blind eye to that because it's important. I also want people to understand that what we're doing as umpires, and you and I are very similar with loving to engage the crowd. They didn't do that.
No, not at all. It's an anachronism.
But it's another area where it's so important that we just kind of have to turn the blind eye to what historically happened with umpires, because there are rules in the book that you're not supposed to
approach the umpire. Distinctly
so
says,
this is
not
one where
the umpire. Yeah.
Yes, one where I gladly break it, because it is so important for us to teach the spectators a little bit about what's going on, so they get enthused, if you will, to come back and do
Very
it
true.
again. And so I really appreciate what you're doing, how you're doing it, and the fact that you're really growing with the historical accuracy stuff, because we need more of that. So thank you.
Corky, that is something actually, and again, this goes back to just having that knowledge. Knowing those details helps you in your presentation. I oftentimes will say, this wouldn't have been happening. If you were really seeing this match in 1859 or 1860, you wouldn't be talking to me the way you are now, because that was not allowed. So those are places where the anachronism has to be pointed out, but you have to break it in order to be doing the instruction. And it's just important. And sometimes I will, I talk about playing this character of Honest Al. When I'm Honest Al, it's 1860. When I'm Alan Stair, I can talk about what Honest Al might be doing back in 1860, but then I will go back and forth between the two characters. So that is a way to keep people in the moment of that, that 1860 or 1861 match that's going on, but then also be instructing them as a historian talking about something that happened a long time ago. You can kind of do both things if you handle it well. And a lot of it is just practice. As you talk with people and as you do this, you'll start to get a pattern, you start to get stories, you start to get things that people seem to respond to and remember, and you will then gravitate back to those and use those as ways to explain later. Anybody else? Questions? Oh, I see that. Greg Gages has wondered what happened to the outcome of the KRP PIG softball game. And yes, guys, if you're not aware, my wife and I last September, as a response to being locked up in the pandemic, started a podcast. We now do a weekly podcast called the WKRP Cast. One of my all-time favorite ever television shows is WKRP in Cincinnati. We're rewatching it week by week, and you can find us on any podcast platform. Go check out the WKRP Cast.
So, Al, you need to tell us some umpiring stories. Give us a couple of examples of the highlights of your career, things that you look back and you go, whoa, was that a day or what?
5 matches at the Ohio Cup on a Sunday. That was a day.
No shade.
That was a day, yeah. And I was set up to do 4, but they came to me and said, you can be down on the meadow if you want, down on the really nice field for the middle of the day. And it would have been my 5th one. And I had 1 match time between to get down there. And I remember we're racing across to get down to the meadow because I was so excited about being, calling on the nice field. So, yeah, by the end of that day, I remember passing out pretty much in the hotel room there in Columbus. But that was a big day. I think probably one of my all-time favorite events we've ever done is the Long Nine in Hannibal, Missouri. Hannibal started a few years ago a steampunk festival. And if you guys are not familiar with steampunk, steampunk is the idea that all science and technology has advanced to present day, but we never got away from powering it with steam. We never went to electricity or any other method. We power everything with steam. So steampunk is set in the 1860s, but they've all got these weird costumes and interesting, it's not historically accurate. It's all anachronism, but it's playing that period. Somebody had the bright idea, hey, we ought to have these vintage baseball guys come in and play during the Steampunk Festival. It is some of the most fun experiences we have ever had because steampunk is a lot of kids. They're all in their 20s and 30s, and they love this stuff. They soak up this information. They want every bit of detail they can get about that era, and we played in the Mark Twain Field there in Hannibal, which was a WPA project that was built for, at the time, a semi-pro team that was hosted in Hannibal. So a ton of history there. And then also, they just let me talk to this assembled group of probably a couple hundred people in the stands whenever I felt like it. So that's a lot of fun. I like doing that one every year. We go there every fall over Labor Day weekend. So, yeah, individual stories I'm blanking out, but just a lot of fun days and a lot of fun events. Going to Hobart. I've been to Hobart a couple times. They let me call there sometimes. Just love that. The Field of Dreams event was amazing.
Old World, Wisconsin. This is the last time I saw you umpire. I can't remember why you were there.
Where was that?
Old World, Wisconsin. Didn't you come up and umpire the game up there?
Yeah, boy, that was a couple years ago.
That's been 3 or 4 years ago.
That's the General Grierson event when the horses bucked the guys and ran away.
Oh yeah, we've had some Grierson issues. Yeah. Well, the cannons going off at the end of one of the matches. I remember guys in the outfield ducked. they were dropping to the ground.
That and the machine guns.
Yes.
We did both. It was quite a sight.
Yeah. Anybody else?
As the drifter, I will be with the Long Nine quite a bit this year. I'm looking forward to your tutelage. Certainly, I've heard a lot about you. Never met you, heard a lot about you.
Oh, well, great. I hope it's all good. So it's like he's the big loud guy over there. Yeah.
Al, is there like a retainer or something that we need to send you to come up to Cali?
A lot of times, if I have to stay overnight, just pay for my hotel room. But otherwise, I just love coming out. I just have a blast. And really, I've been all over the Midwest on my own dime. Topeka, when they formed the club over there, I went over a couple of times there for a season and called for them. So, and that's about a 5-hour drive for me from where I am. But I just love doing this. I have a blast doing it. And like I said, some of the best people you're going to meet anywhere in the world, you're going to meet at a vintage baseball match. The players, the people that come out to see it, just everybody's always wonderful, and we have a blast wherever we go. My wife likes to dress up. She's got a hoop skirt that's period. We went down to Tennessee. We were on an actual historic plantation down in Tennessee a couple of years ago. South in Nashville, and my wife walking around in this hoop skirt with a little parasol, it really transports you back. So we both like to come out and do sideline and do umpiring. So if you ever need an umpire, you got some big event going on, we'd look to come in.
You got it.
All righty.
Thanks so much, Al. Another great program. And
sure thing. Thank you, guys.